Pula. I'm Dr. Pate, and this is my presentation on epigenetics and chronic disease. In this presentation, I will be highlighting some interesting points about a person's DNA in relation to their health and well-being and the role that genetics plays in chronic disease. I'll also weigh in on the debate of nature versus nurture, on which has more influence, your genes or your environment. So we start by looking at genetics, and to do this we need to start with Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin had a theory of evolution which stated that all species of an organism arise and developed through a process of natural selection. And the crux of Darwin's theory of evolution focused on the elimination of an inferior species gradually over time through many generations through natural selection. And this meant that a particular gene was passed on, a dominant gene was passed on, as an inferior one would have been removed naturally. And even today we still subscribe to this theory, and one of the examples of Darwin's theory of evolution was specifically with giraffes. And he hypothesized that giraffes had short necks and long necks millions of years ago, and that only the long-necked giraffe survived because of the scarcity of food at a lower level, and therefore only the long-necked giraffes were able to pass on their genes, and that's why we only see long-necked giraffes today. And moving on with genetics, in 1970 Francis Crick came up with the central dogma of genetics, which basically showed that DNA is transcribed and translated, and it produced proteins, and again this is passed on to your offspring as you develop. And in medical school we learned that genetics was the study of heredity, and heredity is a biological process again which shows that our parents pass on certain genetic materials to children, and we pass them on to our children, and so on and so forth. And basically every child inherits DNAs from both their biological parents, and this again in turn expresses specific traits. And so if your parents had a particular disease, you were very likely to also develop that disease sometime in your life. And this eventually came up with a central theme that our genes are our fate. Now, in order to understand whether our genes are really our fate, we need to understand a little bit about genetics. Okay, and so genetics, it starts from within the cell or within a special structure inside the cell called a nucleus. And the nucleus contains 46 chromosomes, 23 of which come from your dad and 23 come from your mom. Now these chromosomes contain deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA, which is very, very long, so it's tightly bound around proteins called histones. And DNA have sections of it called bases, and these bases contain the codes for making proteins through a process of transcription. Now initially when transcription happens, DNA is copied, a strand of the DNA is copied into a shorter strand called the messenger RNA, or mRNA. And this mRNA is then, it leaves the cell and goes out into the cytoplasm to find another structure called a ribosome. Now the ribosome uses the information on the mRNA to form amino acids, and it starts to join these amino acids, and multiple amino acids then form a protein, and this protein can be manipulated into unique three-dimensional structures and then released from the cell. And proteins are basically the building blocks for the rest of the cells in our body, and they have functions, other functions like immunity and so on. So with a basic understanding of how DNA is transcripted and translated to form proteins, let's have a look at some gene problems and how this can lead to the formation of abnormal protein. Now this is a very well-studied disease called sickle cell disease, which can form sickle cell anemia, and it's an example of how a single code in the gene could lead to the combination of an abnormal sequence of amino acids that form an abnormal protein. Now the mutagen here is found on the hemoglobin beta gene, and it's transcripted and translated to form an abnormal protein, which then goes on to cause the hemoglobin cell to stick together, forming long fibers that distort the shape of the red blood cell, and this in turn causes sickle cell disease, which causes sickle cell anemia. Now there are a whole host of other diseases that manifest themselves after a problem with gene expression. Diseases like cystic fibrosis, Huntington's disease, and even Down syndrome are caused by gene problems. Diseases that have been implicated to have a particular gene are diseases like breast cancer, certain types of heart disease, and even diabetes. So that's it then. With knowledge of a particular hereditary gene, one can be confidently condemned to a life of disease and misery, right? Enter the science of epigenetics. Now, epigenetics is a relatively new science, and it's the study of the changes in gene activity that do not involve an actual change to the genetic code, but it still can get passed down to at least one successive generation. Now, this Time magazine article published in 2010 highlighted epigenetics and its impact on gene expression, which now opens up many possibilities as far as diseases related to genes are concerned. And this new science of epigenetics reveals how the choices you make can change your genes' expressions and even those of your children. Now, how is this possible, you may ask? Well, this is an agouti mouse. Agouti is the gene that controls the natural pigment in the hair of mammals. In mice, the gene also creates the propensity for the mouse to become obese, have diabetes, and usually to die young. In 2003, scientists Waterland and Jertel randomly assigned agouti mouse into two groups and fed one group normal mouse food and the other group fortified food with folic acid, vitamin B12, choline chloride, and anhydrous betadine. Now, all these fortified foods add methyl to DNA. Now, these mice were fed these different diets from the 8th week of their lives and throughout pregnancy and lactation. And their offspring were examined, and this is what they found. The offspring of the agouti mice being fed fortified foods were phenotypically different from their mothers. They were genetically similar, but phenotypically different. They had brown fur, they were not obese or susceptible to diabetes, and they lived longer lifespans. In fact, this photo is of the second generation mice who were around the same age. So the scientists demonstrated that small changes in nutrition could alter disease susceptibility without having to actually change the gene. So not changing the genome, but changing the epigenome. So we see how gene expression in mice could be affected by just simply changing what they ate. But what about humans? So in this experiment of epigenetics, Dr. Dean Ornish took a group of prostate cancer patients and divided them into two groups. One group got conventional treatment with drugs, and the others were put on a 90-day lifestyle modification program, complete with diet, which was plant-based, stress management, exercise, and social support group sessions. The study demonstrated that lifestyle and nutrition changes modified the gene expression in patients with prostate cancer. And this modification in the gene expression resulted in slowing the tumor growth. Now, this was done at the DNA level through downregulation of gene expression, in essence, turning the genes off. So again, through methylation of the gene, the expression of the particular code of prostate cancer was suppressed. So in these two studies, you can see the exact role that epigenetics plays in gene expression. So it's becoming more and more obvious that the central dogma is incomplete, and we are just starting to scratch the surface of epigenetics. But already the studies are looking very promising in being able to manipulate our genome without having to change it, for the purpose of preventing and possibly reversing many diseases. And the best part about it is that the solutions are very, very simple, and they could be as simple as adjusting what you eat, how you move, and the environment in which you live. Our genes are definitely not our fate. It's time to weigh in on our nature versus nurture. Nature in that our genetics determine our behavior, and nurture in that our environment, our upbringing, and our life experiences determine our behavior. We've already begun to talk about this a little bit, but let's look at this study that was published in 2004. Again, looking at rats, but this time the behavior of the rats and how it related to genes and gene expressions. So the experiment was done on two separate sets of rats. One rat had their mothers lick their pups often, and the other set didn't. So in essence, one set of rats took better care of their pups than the other. Now the first thing they found was that when the children of the licking and non-licking mothers grew up, they carried on the behavior of their mothers. In fact, it became a family tradition amongst the two different groups. So the question was asked, if the rats were already genetically designed to be caring mothers. So to test this theory, the researchers then decided to swap the rats. So they took a rat from a not so much licking mother and put it with a licking mother. And what they found was that rat became a high licking rat as well. So they concluded that it could not have been a genetic predisposition. Then another group of researchers went to look specifically at the brains of these two different types of rats, and specifically at a glucocorticoid receptor. Now this receptor is usually switched off in baby rats with a methyl group attached. They found that the licking rat's genes became expressed as the methyl group was removed. So somehow the better care environment that the rats received changed the genetic expression of their genes. This clearly demonstrated that nurture can have a profound impact on nature. Again, proof that DNA is not. So to conclude, we are able to manipulate the expression of our genes using epigenetics to prevent diseases like cancer and many other chronic diseases. The science on this is still in its infancy, but already many positive signs have been seen. Now, nurturing has an epigenetic effect on our nature and DNA, and this again can lead to possibly preventing diseases and living a longer and happier life. And the best thing about it is that the choice of gene expression is ours to make. Thank you.